Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And in this video, I'll be ranking the new Journey to Unguro class legendary minions from worst to best. Now, keep in mind that I won't just be ranking these cards in a vacuum based on their raw power or raw value. I'm going to be considering them in the context of what I expect the Journey to Unguro meta to be at least a little bit. So, for instance, if a card just has tons of value, but it looks like it won't fit in any deck, or it might just be too slow in an aggressive meta, then that card's not going to rank particularly well in my mind. All that said, let's go ahead and jump into the list. Starting off with number 9, or the worst of the legendary minions. This is exactly the card I was talking about. Yes, Pyros is the kind of card that offers you a ton of value. He basically gives you 3 cards in one. You get something like 18 in total stats for Pyros across the course of the game. So in a deck that theoretically could play that late and just needed a ton of resources and wanted to grind out your opponent, Pyros is exactly the kind of card that could do that successfully. But unfortunately, even in an elemental synergy deck, based on the elemental synergy cards we've seen thus far, Pyros is still just too darn slow, because ultimately the body you're getting for the cost is always equal to the cost. So 2 mana 2/2, 6 mana 6/6, etc. So as he gets more expensive, he actually gets harder and harder to combo out with other elemental cards and other, elemental synergies, and he just doesn't do enough actively to the board. So yes, he can set up multiple future elemental turns, no doubt about that, but it's just not enough here with this card. It's a pure long-term value game, but far too slow of an impact on the board, and unfortunately for that reason, Pyros just looks like a pretty weak card. Moving on to the second worst class legendary minion. This one is for Rogue, unfortunately, which hasn't ranked particularly well on my class legendary rankings for Unguro, but this is Shaman, the Corpse Flower, a new 4 mana 5/3 minion with some of the goofiest looking artwork I've ever seen. This doesn't exactly feel legendary to me, but this card's problem is that with its death rattle, how this works is it goes dormant when it dies, and then if you play 4 cards in a single turn, he'll come back to life, right? And he can attack again and do all the same stuff. So it's an endless cycle. As long as he'll turn into a seed pod, and as long as that seed pod is there, which it will always be there because it's unremovable from your opponent, as long as you're playing 4 cards in a turn, you can bring him back to life. But who really wants to bring a 5/3 minion back to life all that much? It's just so weak and dies to virtually everything, and then you have to go back to reactivating his effect once again to see any long-term value. And you might say playing 4 cards in a turn is not that difficult for Rogue. I would agree with that in general, that's true, but unfortunately, you can only play 4 cards in a turn so many times before you're out of cards. You only have 30 cards in your deck, so by the time you've done this 7 times, you're out of luck. And frankly, that's going to be nearly impossible to accomplish 7 times just because there's other things happening in the game, and you may not have that much card draw outside of the perfect Gadget Zan Auctioneer scenarios. So even in a perfect environment, in a perfect world where you get this off exactly as you want, I just don't think it's going to make that big of an effect, because you're going to be hamstrung basically playing cards you may or may not want to play just to get it off. Even then, you just get a 3 health minion back that can attack immediately. So there's a lot of issues with Shaman as far as I'm concerned. He's a really meager card every other turn if you meet a perfect condition, and that's just not worth it in the world where there's so many cool, interesting, strong new effects. Up next on my list is Tyrannis, the new Druid legendary minion. This is really just a 12/12 beast with a very simple effect that you can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. Now, this is a scary minion from a raw power standpoint. As I mentioned, this is one of the biggest and one of the best, right, as far as bodies are concerned. But again, a card that just suffers from being a tad too slow. Even in a class like Druid that has ramp and it has innervate and it has ways to reduce this to 0 cost now with its new legendary quest, it's still just not going to make a big enough impact on the board. The same problem that Pyros has. Unless you happen to give it taunt, there's very little way to actually force a reaction through this card for your opponent. So he's just going to kind of sit there as a giant body that your opponent can sort of taunt wall off, can ignore and go face. And because of that, it's going to cost a lot of investment, both in a turn sense and in a resources sense, to actually develop this card on the board. And often your opponent won't really care all that much because they have, at the very least, 2 to 3 turns to survive its attacks and accomplish things in the meantime. Not to mention, there are still ways to remove this minion from the board despite its card text, with things like Battle Cry, Big Game Hunter, or the new Rogue minion that can destroy a minion from a Battle Cry. So, and Twisting Nethers and all those kind of ultimate board clears too. So Tyrannis just doesn't feel like it accomplishes quite enough for the amount of resources you have to pump in to get it out there. Moving on to the next card, it is the Warrior Legendary Minion, another big dinosaur, but this time it's King Mosh, a 9/7 beast with a really interesting battle cry that allows you to destroy all damaged minions. So it's a bit like Deathwing in many ways, but the condition is that the minions have to already be damaged. So there's an ideal scenario here for 10 mana where you can whirlwind the board and then play King Mosh and essentially destroy everything and get yourself a Deathwing that doesn't discard your hand, which sounds awesome because Deathwing is arguably a playable card already as is for just that last second bailout kind of play. And this one allows you to do that without actually bailing out. It still allows you to dominate the board and keep your resources. So it's not terrible, don't get me wrong. A lot of the cards on this list are good, so I don't absolutely hate King Mosh. The problem and the reason he ranks this far back in the list is simply that that's not always a condition that's going to be easy to meet. In other words, you have to kind of include a specific card in your deck to accomplish that in a single turn with Whirlwind, because all the other Whirlwind effects, Ravaging Ghoul, etc., are more expensive and you won't be able to do them together most of the time unless something crazy happens with card reductions or whatever. But the condition is too difficult to meet. It also harms your own side of the board, which can be a problem, particularly, I think, with Warrior. It seems like it's going to be a class that wants to have taunt minions out all the time and just develop their own board in many ways. So King Mosh has some downsides. It's a hard condition to meet. If it does go off, it's fantastic, almost undebatably so. But because I think it's going to require a little bit too much of a sacrifice in your deck to include cards you might not necessarily want to include, and you have to draw into the right 2 cards to make this one work, I feel like King Mosh is just a little bit too conditional and risky to actually play. So up next is the Priest minion Lyra the Sunshard, a new 5-mana 3/5 elemental that I have to say a lot of people are hating on. A lot of people think this might be the worst of the new legendary minions. I'm obviously not quite so harsh on this card. I think it can actually be rather strong because the effect here is whenever you cast a spell, you get to add a random priest spell to your hand. And I think the biggest criticism of this card is that priest has a lot of bad spells that you won't really want to get. So a ton of spells that require very specific kinds of conditions that won't necessarily be on the board. But in that regard, I think that's probably okay. This is not a 5-mana play. This is a kind of card you play late in the game with 1 or 2 very specific spells. It's a thing that your opponent has to answer. It's sort of a Fandral Staghelm, maybe with less instant value, but potentially more long-term value. So in a kind of game where you can generate a couple extra Shadow Word Deaths or get that Shadow Word Pain in the clutch. In Wild, you're going to get stuff like Entomb off this card, which is absolutely crazy. So it's not going to take too many big hits all that often to make this guy pay off. And I think that's going to happen more consistently than people think. Frankly, if you just get like 1 or 2 Power Word Shields from time to time, this is going to feel like a pretty valuable card. It's, if it's generating Power Word Shields for you, it's basically going to be like a 3/7 draw a card for 5 mana, which is a super Azure Drake. Now, some people might say, well, for a legendary minion, don't you want it to be more than an Azure Drake? Well, sure, but Azure Drake's an incredibly good card. So it's not, in other words, it's just not going to take that much to make Lyra the Sunshard a big hit in a majority of its games. I think people are dreaming too big with this card, and I think just a couple small spells can often be enough to make this worth the inclusion. It may not necessarily feel like a legendary minion necessarily if it doesn't do something absolutely incredible, but when it provides consistent, reliable value, which I think it actually will in the long term, it's going to fail sometimes, but very rarely, I think that means it's going to be worth an inclusion. Now, maybe not in a Death Rattle Priest deck, or maybe not in some sort of Elemental Synergy deck, but in a Reno-style deck in particular, when Priest has other Reno-style cards, Lyra the Sunshard allows you to get the second Shadow or Death, right, in a Reno deck that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So I'm actually fairly high on Lyra the Sunshard. I think this guy's going to work out with spell synergies much better than people probably realize. So moving on to the fourth best legendary minion on my list, it is the Hunter minion Swamp King Dread, a new big dinosaur yet again, this time 7 mana, 9/9 beast, and after your opponent plays a minion, attack it. So this is kind of the ultimate taunt card or ultimate defensive card as long as you have some sense of initiative on the board. In other words, it's not taunt in the sense that if your opponent already has 5 minions out there that can kill you, it's not going to help at all. But if you have any tempo advantage at all, Swamp King Dread can really shut down what your opponent is trying to accomplish. Now, a lot of people are saying that this card is very susceptible to things like poisonous effects or really high attack, low health minions that sets up good trades for your opponent. All of those things are true, but I don't really think they're going to be that likely. Poisonous is not something we've seen a ton of. Yes, it is an adaptation that they're going to get a third of the time and hit a big win on that with a really cheap minion, but we don't really, I at least don't suspect adaptation to be a huge part of the meta necessarily. There's a few adaptation cards and a few potentially good decks as I see it, so I'm not considering that a huge threat when assessing this card. So what I am seeing is a card that has a lot of defensive potential that makes some very high friction scenarios for your opponent where they don't really know what to do. Sometimes they just feel terrible and they have to play minions out to Swamp King Dread, giving you a huge decision-making advantage, strategic advantage that would otherwise be impossible because we've never seen an effect like this before. So this may not fit in like a Hunter Quest deck environment, but in a mid-range or control-style Hunter, I can see this card doing a lot of work. So now it's time for my top 3, starting off with the new Paladin minion, Sunkeeper Tareem, the 6 mana 3/7 taunt with a battle cry that sets all other minions attack and health to 3. So Keeper of Ultimate is a card that has had this same effect in the past. Now, that was a one-off, you did it once to one minion, and that served as a really flexible tool for allowing you to sort of debuff big minions that your opponent played, so taking that 12/12 down to a 3/3, but also sometimes buff your own Silverhand recruits to give you a bigger presence on the board, and that card had a lot of flexibility. And frankly, I think that extrapolates really nicely to Sunkeeper Tareem. It's the kind of card that if you are playing a more board-based, probably mid-range Paladin deck, this can turn a lot of small stuff into 3/3s and kind of push your opponent over. But also it has some defensive utility against something like a Jade Druid. They might have 3 minions out there that are 6/6, 7/7, 8/8, and you turn them into 3/3s. And this guy very nicely has 3 attack and 7 health that lines up with all that. So he would trade into 3/3 minions perfectly, assuming there's not some other answer, right? So he basically kind of counters the board all by himself. And for 6 mana, I think that's a really strong effect because you can often do other stuff with it. Sunkeeper Tareem into True Silver Champion, right? Allows you to kill whatever minion might be out there. So even if it's just one thing, if you're just trying to kill a Ragnaros, right? This is the kind of card that could set that up, could make that possible, especially if you've got other things on the board. So I think this is going to provide some really big swing turns that people aren't necessarily expecting. It's going to allow you to do crazy things as long as you have any sort of board or removal in hand. This is the kind of thing that maybe even makes Hammer of Wrath a halfway decent card, right? Because that's a cool 2-card punch. But I think we'll find Sunkeeper Tareem sneaking his way into a variety of Paladin decks just because he is fairly flexible and his effect is ultimately quite strong. Up next at my number 2 spot is Clutch Mother Zavas. I made that disclaimer at the beginning of the video where I really want to focus on the influence of what I suspect the Unguro meta will be. That was a little bit for Pyros, but primarily for Clutch Mother Zavas, because I think this card is going to support a very dominant archetype in Journey to Unguro, which is a discard Warlock, probably of the Zoo variety in particular. That's already nearly a tier 1 deck, probably more of a tier 2 deck currently, and it's getting so many new tools, including Clutch Mother Zavas herself. This is a new 2 mana 2/2 beast that whenever you discard this card in particular, you give it +2/+2, and you return it to your hand. So with all the potential discard effects, we've all had the Silverware Golem perfectly discarded that summoned a 3/3, and how significant of a tempo play that is for the discard Zoo Warlock. Clutch Mother's Office is the same kind of thing. She's not going to give that much instant tempo like the Silverware Golem, but she's going to build up passive tempo essentially for a few turns, and then you're going to get to make an insane tempo play with a 2-mana 6/6, right? Some point down the line, just maybe probably a couple turns away with so many discard effects available to Warlock now. And frankly, there's going to be so many other good discard cards that reward discards that you can just run every discard available, I think, and build a really cool deck, because half the time you're going to hit big on some sort of beneficial discard effect. So Clutch Mother's Office has the potential to be almost an Edwin Van Cleef type of card, right, where she's that really cheap giant body. Even if she's not, a 2-mana 4/4 is fantastic on its own in a zoo kind of deck, right? So it probably only takes one result to really make this a big hit if you're trying to get big minions out onto the board as fast as possible. So, you know, discarding this on 1 and playing it on 2, or discarding it on 2, playing on 3, whatever it might be, is a crazy kind of play that can already basically win you a game. So I like this card a lot for its effect, but I really like this card because I think it's going to be in such a dominant kind of deck and really encourage and support that archetype. But there's one last card that has to take the #1 spot on my list for 2 reasons. 1, I think it's going to be in a dominant deck, and 2, I think it's just absolutely bonkers what it actually does. This is the Shaman legendary minion Kalamos, Primal Lord, a new 8-mana 7/7. Stat line that Shaman loves. But this battle cry is nuts on Kalamos. If you played an elemental last turn, cast an elemental invocation. And I don't have the invocations up here, but basically you get to pick between 4 different spells that are cast instantly. And it's an array of stuff. You can summon a board of 1/1s. You can heal yourself. You can deal damage to your opponent. And probably best of all, you can deal damage to your opponent's board, killing their minions, sort of like a mini flame strike in a sense. So this is a card that's ultimately flexible. It doesn't really matter what board state you're in. Kalamos can do something advantageous. Now, there's going to be some turns where it feels a little better to play it than others, but you're always going to get some sort of value out of Kalamos, and that's what makes him so good. He's just going to fit. And Shaman is getting so many strong elemental synergy cards that it looks like actually activating the battle cry here is going to be rather trivial in my mind. I think you're going to get it off most of the time when you want, and you're going to be keeping elementals out consistently enough that you're never going to deny yourself a Kalamos turn, it seems. So Elemental Shaman feels like a fantastic deck. Kalamos Primal Lord is basically the king of that deck, the crowning achievement that's going to be a big swing turn most of the time. So how can you go wrong with this card if it's incredibly powerful on its own right, and it also fits into what I think is going to be one of the strongest decks in the meta in Journey to Unguro? I think a lot of us are going to be sick of seeing Kalamos Primal Lord before long, because to me this is far and away the best of the class legendaries in Journey to Unguro. So there you have it, that's my list, but I want to hear what your list is. Where would you rank these cards? What cards did I get right? What cards did I get wrong? Share those thoughts in the comments, and I'll be happy to read everything that you guys have to say on this topic. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.